Welcome to Sports, Clicks, and Politics with your hosts, Ben Hussong and me, Shawn Hannon. I want to welcome to the show a gentleman who has spent decades collaborating with dozens of credentialed scientists from around the world regarding the younger Dryas impact hypothesis, while also working closely with many alternative history science communicators such as Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. He has nearly 1,000 younger Dryas impact citations. You can check out his work at cosmictusk.com. Ladies and gentlemen, George Howard. George, thank you for your time today. I am looking forward to a lively discussion.
Hey, that's great, Shawn. I'm happy to be on, happy to join you and Ben, and I'm honored to be on your 100th podcast. Congratulations on that. Quite a milestone.
Yeah, I think when I reached out to you, we have covered a lot of things, and throughout the our podcast basically started in the middle of the George Floyd riots and became a COVID podcast for the last 2.5 years, or whatever we're as we get close to episode here 100. But we're trying to break away from the Jeffrey Epstein, Hunter Biden laptop and COVID talk to maybe talk about something a little bit more lighthearted, like the end of the world.
Yeah, well, those are all worthy topics, but they're well covered. And I can assure you mine is not well covered.
Yes,
so maybe we'll introduce it to some people.
And just as you point that out, I did a little market research, and I'm going to say this is a market research of 5 individuals. 0 of those 5 ever heard of the words younger Dryas.
Well, that's true. It's also true in my professional life. I'm a environmental mitigation banker, and no one knows what the hell that is. So if somebody asks me about my avocation and my vocation, you're looking at 2 30-minute conversations right there, man.
Yeah.
But I hope to live long enough for both of them to become well known, and particularly the younger Dryas hypothesis, because that has importance to every single person on Earth if they're concerned about their past or their future.
Yeah. Okay. So let me tee this up a little bit. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Carolina booms.
Yeah. The Seneca guns, you'll hear them called.
Yeah, right. The Seneca guns, exactly. Yeah. So we're in upstate New York, so we have a lot of Native American, and Seneca is labeled up here in our parts. But the Carolina booms, and I don't want to talk about that here now, basically led me to the Carolina bays, which I found utterly fascinating and haven't not found fascinating ever since. At one point along the way, I definitely stumbled upon your work. I have been following along with Antonio Zamora's work. That feels like like a daily thing. Yeah, it's great. And I have a couple images here that I'll try to share with the folks as we go along here to try to show what we're talking about. But I think I would say the genesis of your catastrophism is from the Carolina bays, but I feel like you have, cut your teeth in the Carolina bays, or at least you had a lot of your avocation was started with the Carolina bays. Is that accurate?
Yeah. The first, I referred to it there. I'm in the large scale environmental restoration business, and the first wetland I restored was a Carolina Bay, but I'd heard about it before that from my boss. I worked in the U.S. Senate for 6 years, and I can tell a little story about that if you like, or you can show some pictures. And the Carolina bays are kind of the kookiest of the many parts of our theory. Many of the parts aren't kooky, but the Carolina bays remain unexplained and could remain unexplained the rest of our life. But the way I came about them was I was working in policy, environmental policy there in the Senate, and for the personal office of the junior senator from North Carolina at that time, Duncan McLaughlin Locke Faircloth. And he was a big-time farmer country boy, Locke Faircloth, old school, former Democrat, whatnot. But he was he was a farmer's farmer, and also very intelligent, wonderful person who I learned a lot from. So studying environmental stuff and working on wetlands policy, I kept seeing, in various descriptions of wetland types around the country, you'd see swamps, fens, bogs, cypress forests, Carolina bays. And I'd always, working in it and working in a North Carolina office, I was like, what the hell is that Carolina bays, And that was mostly pre-internet. That it actually just came out when I had this discussion I'm going to describe. So then the boss one day, he said, get me a 1 to 24,000 topo, USGS topo quad of my farm. And I didn't know what the hell that was. I do now because I work with them a lot of my work, but that's standard United States Geological Service map. You might have 10 or 20 of them in a given county. So I called up USGS Congressional Affairs, as you can do as a Senate staffer. And I said, hey, could y'all get me one of these maps, of Sampson County, North Carolina? And they said, yes, sir, we will. And courier comes over and brings the tube. So they must have had a warehouse in DC where they actually kept some of that stuff. So very proud to have acquired it. I walked in the senator's office, asked him if he had a few moments, and he did. And I said, I got your map. So I rolled it out on his desk, and he put his arms down, and I had no idea what he wanted to study about it, but he was just a study. And I was looking over his shoulder, and I saw a series of perfectly aligned, but generally different sized, just as you're showing on the screen now, dotted green lines, which is the way USGS shows Carolina bays. They don't do any of the elevation or any of that like your fine LiDAR pick above, but you could see like on the bottom, the dotted green lines. And I said, Senator, what the hell? He cussed a lot, and we were welcome to cuss too. I said, what the hell are all those dotted green lines all over your land? He said, meteor holes. And I was like, meteor holes? And he said, yeah, when I was a boy, it was all over the news. We were all excited about it. And he actually got it right. He didn't say asteroid. He said a comet came in, and a whole bunch of little pieces of it slammed into North Carolina and up and down the East Coast and just destroyed everything. And he was probably 10 years old, so it'd have been 1933 or so. And I said, no kidding, I've never heard of such a thing. I kind of a sciencey guy, even though I was more political at that time, but I had a background of intense interest in science. And I said, Senator, I've just never heard of that there were any craters in North Carolina. And he goes, yeah, they call them Carolina bays. And I was like, that's what that is. I thought it was like a marina or something, or, a baseball team, or who the hell knows what it is. And then I became absolutely hooked on it. And I went back to my computer, and literally the internet had been hooked up a week or two before. And I was one of the first people to get it in the Senate as a staffer. And I Googled in there, and the early website, still much the same, that Bob Kobres, Kobres, who at that time worked in the University of Georgia library system, had set up. And he had hoisted a bunch of stuff on Carolina bays. And it was good stuff. And it was intriguing papers from the past. And as it turned out, there was a very intense scientific controversy over these features from when they were first discovered in the 1930s. Maybe going on too long for you, Shawn.
No, you're fine. And go ahead. And like I said, I was going to hope you were going to say what the mainstream accepted theory was at some point about these Carolina bays.
That's right. Well, the first thing people thought, they rolled the maps out. They'd taken a bunch of aerial photos in the Depression and Works Progress Administration thing, rolled them out in Myrtle Beach, and they were astounded to see that what they knew is generally oval lakes out there and depressions in the ground were absolutely everywhere outside of Myrtle Beach. And they immediately thought, some of the first people that saw it said, well, my God, must be something came from above. All that was created at the same time, and they must be some type of craters. And craters were just beginning to be accepted at that time. It wasn't well into the 20th century that they even agreed that the big hole out in Arizona, meteor crater, Barringer crater, was not caused by volcanism, but caused by a cosmic object. So it looked so much like something that come from above that a number of researchers dove in. And it was kind of accepted at first. And that's what the senator was remembering when it was as big as a boy. It had been on the cover of Harper's Magazine. It said the comet that hit the Carolinas. And it's a little bit like the Younger Dryas hypothesis itself, in that at first it was accepted and it was interesting and it's fun to talk about. And then the trolls came out. And they were responsible trolls in that day, and they were assholes, but they were probably a better version of asshole than we have today. And they started slinging papers at each other and spent about 20 years slinging papers at each other. And it breaks down into an extraterrestrial, as in not of this earth, and a terrestrial camp. And the terrestrial camp, in the end, and more or less at the beginning, well, first of all, there are about 15 different explanations of what they are, and anybody can read those on the internet, and I won't bore you with them now, but they kind of break down that way, with most of them being terrestrial because it's very hard to explain them terrestrially. So there are a bunch of disagreeing things about how they happen. But by the 1970s, in a key paper that was written by a guy, Ray Kakrowski, that supposedly put it to bed, said that the Carolina bays were the result of persistent post-glacial or glacial winds, called katabatic winds, I believe, that are intense winds we don't see today, blowing across the flat, sandy landscape of the Atlantic coastal plain. And that by virtue of that aeolian process, it dug out and ellipticized a depression, which some were filled again as lakes. And if you look at Google Earth, it's just a gift, Carolina Bay studies. And you can see all up and down the East Coast if you look carefully, but you cannot miss them at the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these ellipses. And Kober suspected that they may have been caused simultaneously from above. So he was still an advocate on, keeping the flame alive for the extraterrestrial folks. And so I got into it, and I was fascinated by it and talking with my friends and all that kind of stuff. And I was talking to a buddy, real good friend, and he was going back to UNC to finish up his degree. He'd taken about a 5-year hiatus, and he was coming to get a couple of last classes to get his degree. He's taking geology. And he said, "Hey, George, one of the topics on my papers is to geology papers is to do a paper on Carolina bays. That's that stuff you're always talking about, right?" And I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Hey, will you write me some notes on that?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll write you some notes, buddy." So I sat down and I banged out a 27-page paper, and he got a B. And I think that was clear bias because I took the extraterrestrial hypothesis and ran with the history of it and how it had been unfairly treated through the years. And then it had been totally sidelined, like no more to be discussed. And I referred to it in the paper towards the end. I said, it's the crazy ant in the attic of geology. They just don't want to talk about her. They know she's up there. It's embarrassing. They're not bringing her out, and they're not bringing her up at the dinner table. So if you want to ever disturb a geologist, say the term Carolina Bay, and you'll get their attention. So I put that paper on the web, and then in 2001, I got contacted by an archaeologist. It was a little kind of a strange guy, and I didn't pay much attention. And then I got an email from Dr. Richard Firestone, and his address was 1 Cyclotron Drive, Berkeley, California. He worked at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and was an isotopic chemist of some note. And he said, "I'm following up on this stuff. We believe we have found evidence that there was a tremendous catastrophe over northern, central, more or less, North America 13,000 years ago. And when Googling, or I suppose back then Alta Vista or whatever the hell we were using, such terms, we stumbled across this paper that you had just put on the web. And you had concluded, or speaking for others through the years, that something may have happened 13,000 years ago that was a tremendous catastrophe and centered over North America, totally independently. He'd never heard of Carolina bays. So that's always interesting in science when two different groups come to the same conclusion through different, pathways. So I started working with them, and they published a paper. They got in touch with me in the late 90s. They published a paper in 2001, and that went nowhere because they kind of took it in the wrong direction. But they did claim there was a catastrophe and claimed that they had physical evidence for it at the paleo boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, which is noted for a 1,200-year cold period called the Younger Dryas. They published that paper, and then no, I'm going on long here. In 2005, I joined up with a subsequent team of very eminent researchers. Firestone was as well. But they said to Dr. Firestone, "We'd like to come and, with your help and collaboration, revise your hypothesis for what happened back then and try to find more physical evidence and see whether we can get it published in a major journal." And I joined that team as, as a civilian, as a non-credentialed scientist, but I was on all the emails, the calls, helped out where I could, collected evidence where I could. And then in 2007, we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, which is a top 3 journal, providing evidence for that terrible climate crash and what caused the Younger Dryas. And the Carolina bays were some of that first evidence. It has now taken a very back seat because our other evidence is much better. And Carolina bays are so controversial that we don't include it. And even some people on our team do not think that Carolina bays were related to it. So that is a long introductory explanation, Shawn. But that's how I got into this.
Yeah, I appreciate all that, a lot of info. And I got a couple more things about the Carolina bays, and then we'll just keep moving forward here. So one thing I want to make sure everybody sees is how big they are. So like when you look at some of this LiDAR stuff, and I do have the, what is it, Michael Davios, who has the Google Earth overlays or whatever, who you can you can see it all. It's great. But not only are they densely, packed over the whole landscape, they're gigantic. So like,
they're enormous.
I have this picture up. I think people can see it where they're equating this. They have a pig farm, and you can see they're right in the middle of the screen here how big the Carolina bays actually are. And I want to show you, like, they're overlapped, right? So you can see them. They're so densely covering that it's a bombardment. We talked about if there's something coming from above, it's a bombardment across the landscape.
That's right. And they reach, to some degree, they're most frequent in the Carolinas, but they reach from New Jersey to Louisiana. Right. So they're in driving distance of probably 60 million Americans, and no one's ever heard of them because they're so subtle on the ground. You can't tell. All you know is you've hit kind of a dense herbaceous forest, or you've hit a different soil type in an open field. And the very subtle change, the rim, they all have a rim around them. And if they're in a perfect pristine condition, that'll catch your attention. But anyone on the East Coast that has driven down I-95 has passed thousands upon thousands of Carolina bays and been looking at it, but didn't know of it, because you've got to look from above. And that's why Google Earth has been a blessing, and LiDAR has been particularly cool.
And the one other thing I want to talk about the Carolina bays is their orientation. And so let me pull up this, if you guys can see, and I'll bring up the what we have over here and what is Nebraska, but you can see the orientation, as you can see, as you pointed out, New Jersey to all the way down to, as you said, Alabama, or whatever it is. You can see that they're littered, and these are each one of the ellipse that is on the ground also has an orientation, and the orientation slightly alters as you kind of go from north to south.
Exactly.
Matching what we find over here in Nebraska, which has a orientation as well. And if you draw all these back and you find a bullseye here-ish, which I believe is Saginaw Bay, I found that overwhelmingly compelling to a origin spot. I don't understand how wind and some persistent winds are going to cause such a gigantic, widespread ellipse all over, and again in Nebraska, and all have an orientation back to a spot. So I find this super compelling. And if Ben wants to jump in with some questions after you kind of elaborate on this orientation here, this might be a good time to bring Ben in. But I found the orientation on top of the size of those, again, overwhelming compelling, that the mainstream version is just impossible.
Go ahead, Ben. I've gone on at some length, and I'll respond to your observations.
So as someone who is a complete novice to all of this, walk me through how does this happen? Because this seems far too coincidental to be an actual coincidence with what you're saying. So just give me the broad view for those of us who have not gone down this particular rabbit hole, but are open-minded to pretty much anything. Let's go at 1,000 feet. What is the overview? What should people know about this? What are the implications?
That's right. And I guarantee any of your listeners, it is a fabulous rabbit hole. If they have the slightest interest in this, go ahead and scratch out the next 6 to 8 hours with your wife and just say, honey, I'm going down the hole, man. And it could even go much further than that. I mean, you can end up spending years looking at it. But, like any mystery, you don't know what caused them. And I am still undecided, and I'll tell you where I am. But what caused them was either a very crafty wind, a wind that managed to both influence things in one part of the country and a whole swath of another part of the country, influence it in a methodical way, almost as if that wind was just emerging perfectly. And let me tell you, my outstanding problem with the terrestrialists, and I know some of them very well, and some of them are on our publishing team for the Younger Dryas event. So you gotta, you know, I keep an open mind both ways. But the terrestrialists, if you will, the more recent data that's been obtained, and there should be much more because we could explain this ultimately, but they suggest that Carolina bays began forming, I don't have the exact dates at hand, but say 70,000 years ago, and went through 70, 60, through 20,000 years or so of formation, and then they stopped forming. And then they picked up and started forming again, and stopped and picked up and started forming again, with each interval between the formation periods separated by up to 10,000 years, you know, millennia. Now, my first problem is, why would you not be able to see classes of them in some form or fashion, where here are the old ones because they look old and they're pointed slightly different. Here's the next time this phenomenon happened, and you see they don't look quite as beat up and they're pointed slightly different. But it would require a wind that emerged and then came back in exactly the same, with the exact same dynamic 10,000 years later or more. That just doesn't add up to me, because what I believe, and what I'll say, you know, as a personal sticking point on this, is that whatever in the hell happened, it all happened at once. And I think it happened instantly. Okay, so that leads you to very few terrestrial uniformitarian, as you call it in geology, explanations. And it leads you to catastrophic explanations. And that field of study, which is long muted in geology, is called catastrophism. And I am a catastrophist as a result of this stuff. And a catastrophic explanation would be something came from above. But here's the important thing. No one, including a good friend, and glad you're a fan, Shawn, Antonio Zamora, which I recommend, or Michael Davies, who's got a wonderful website at carolinabaysurvey.com. And Antonio Zamora can be found on YouTube easily. But none of us believe that they were caused by objects that slammed into the location of the Carolina Bay. They aren't craters. And that was hypothesized back in the 30s. And even back then, they ran out in them. Two guys from the University of Oklahoma dug in them, looking for the iron rock or the stony meteorite, right? Looking for the objects. And they didn't find them. And that was supposed to be a problem at first. And it did cause them a problem because they were wrong. They weren't direct craters. What everyone who, you know, is interested in their catastrophic causes now believes is that they may have been secondary impact craters, because at that time in Michigan, in the north, there was 2 miles of ice up there. There was an ice sheet that was melting 13,000 years ago, and many, many, you know, thousands of years before that. And if something slammed into it of a cosmic nature and it's 2 miles thick, you're not going to see an ordinary crater beneath it. You might see something that looks like Saginaw Bay, but you're not going to find a crater like you see out in Arizona. But what it would definitely do is kick that ice into the lower atmosphere. And for lack of a better term, you know, you had hypersonic ice boulders launched into not quite to orbit, that would have spent about 9 minutes or so arcing their way across the country like a blood spatter pattern, right? And that's a good way to think of it. And oftentimes you'll find those kind of effects in the Tunguska explosion up in Russia. When you have those kind of concussive events and hypersonic winds and all that kind of stuff, when you get something kicked up like that, it'll go into a butterfly pattern, that it's not surprising that you're going to see it fall separately. And it also, where you see the bays, and this is the key part of Antonio Zamora's approach, is when those hypersonic ice boulders kicked from the ice sheet landed again, it would have been immediately preceded by an earthquake, a very, very powerful earthquake. And if you take the sandy coastal plain in North Carolina in the south and shake it, with the groundwater being so shallow, you get what's called earthquake liquefaction, right? And you can actually find pictures of cars sunk in Japan and whole, apartment buildings, that have sunk down into the ground, because it turns into a slurry. Solid ground turns into a slurry. So you would have a slurry of sand, you'd have the ice slam into it. It would have left, as Antonio has shown in scaled down experiments, an ellipse. And that's important. Every Carolina Bay is a perfect ellipse. And it's very surprising. You can see other depressions around the world that are circular in nature, and those are always pointed out by the terrestrialists. But they never are each one a perfect mathematical ellipse. And that's what we see, particularly in North Carolina and South Carolina. They become a little bit more deformed as you go north and south, but that would be expected too. Think about the blood spatter pattern, right? You're going to have a band of them that are very similar. And as it moves away from the arc of where they fall, you're going to see it kind of change a little bit. So then, of course, the ice would have been melted, and you would have had very little traditional crater evidence. So again, another long explanation, but the subject deserves it sometimes, even if I'm not the person to give it. So does that help, Ben? So you had something come in, slams in the ice sheet, kicks up the ice, you have a slurry of sand, and then you end up with those pock marks. And they're creating the ellipse because if you pass the shock wave that accompanies, now that remember, these things had exceeded the speed of sound coming in. So they would have had a shock wave in front of them. And that shock wave takes the form energetically of a cone, where most of the power is very up front and it goes out. And if you take a cone, dunce cap, and pass it through a flat plane, you end up with an ellipse. So that was Antonio's insight, that the ellipses suggest that a cone of energy passed through that flat surface. And his second insight was that it would have been preceded by liquefaction of the soils. So I'll be quiet for a minute.
Yeah, and I feel like I put up an image that kind of shows that cone that you're describing, and the seemingly perfectly ratioed ellipses there in this image here too. So yeah, so I want to let's see, where do I want to go? Let's so you mentioned the 13,000 years, which we want to move forward now to the younger Dryas impact hypothesis in whole, I guess, since the Carolina Bays was my introduction to that and your contribution to that at the beginning. And now obviously you've moved on to even bigger and better things here. But I want to talk about the temperature changes. I feel like when I talk about the younger Dryas, to anybody who, I'm trying to introduce this to, I talk about the massive and such rapid temperature changes. So, because obviously we are inundated with climate change alarmists telling us how the minuscule amount of warming that has happened over the last measurable amount of time that we have is dwarfed in comparison to what actually happened at the beginning and the end of that 1,100 year period. So why don't you talk about the temperature changes, if you could? I don't know if that's something that you have some input on. I do have an image that I could show that kind of dates back
please do.
A little bit more than 15,000 years. And then maybe you can touch on that if you are so inclined. So here it is. And like I said, this kind of dates back from present time here. And then it goes back again here, 15,000 years. And the shaded area, this 12,800 to 11,006 here before present, is what we know as the younger Dryas.
That's right. And that's the iconic example of abrupt climate change, and has been used for years to suggest that since we're supposedly poking the beast of climate, that sometime that there are examples in the past, obviously we weren't around, where climate can suddenly snap. Okay, so it's very important to understand that the younger Dryas is well accepted mainstream science, but it's considered a mystery because there's no good mechanism for how it happened. And if you ask what happened, and what did happen was temperatures in North America dropped, in the Northern Hemisphere, dropped 20 degrees on average, and they actually rose in the Southern Hemisphere. So the world's climate just went suddenly haywire. And there are other dramatic changes, such as mass extinctions that we can discuss as well. But that was a terrible, terrible time for planet Earth. And that is absolutely acknowledged by mainstream science. The question is what caused it. If you ask one of those scientists what caused it, they would first tell you it's a mystery. Then you'd say, well, give me a little bit more than that. They'd say, well, the Gulf Stream shut down. And again, that's well accepted today. And you'd say, well, what caused the Gulf Stream to shut down? They said, well, a whole bunch of fresh water poured into it off the Canadian ice sheet from Lake Agassiz, which was a giant glacial lake in Canada. And they say, well, what caused that lake to suddenly burst and pour out into the Gulf Stream? They'd say, well, we don't know. Right? That sometimes glaciers just let go of their lakes, and we can see examples of that, in modern times. But it's not very satisfying because it was so dramatic. And as you can see, there's some swings before that. But here's the interesting thing about the younger Dryas, and maybe those swings had similar causes. Fortunately, the other thing that graph shows is how wonderful it's been since then. The younger Dryas breaks just as suddenly as it starts. And then today we've had an unprecedented 13,000 years of very, very, very stable climate. But the question is, in the dramatic swings that climate experienced for several 100,000 years before that we have records for, this one is distinguished by having caused the extinction of more than 250 different species of animals went extinct during the younger Dryas. And they had survived other climate swings in the past. If you drug that graph back, you can see over time that there have been other events like that. Nothing so recent as the younger Dryas are so well defined, but climate had swung around and there were no mass extinctions. But again, 250 species go extinct, including, all sorts of wild fauna. And remember, this is not the dinosaur impact was 65 million years ago. That's 5,000 times longer ago than this was. If you drew a timeline from where I am to somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean, this event would only be down at the 7-Eleven 2 or 3 blocks from here, right? It is very, very recent geological time, approximately 3 times the pyramids construction in times. If the pyramids were constructed 4,500 years ago, so it's about 3 times that long ago. People walked the earth. Modern Homo sapiens walked the earth. And the culture in North America at the time was called the Clovis people. That was the first widespread Indian, Native American, indigenous culture in North America. And there's a lot of speculation about previous peoples that may have come there, but there's nobody disputes that the first widespread tool producing people in North America were these people called the Clovis people. And they are known for their beautiful spear points, right? That's a plastic one, because this would be a very, very expensive item. That's the type point for Clovis right there. And you find these arrowheads from Seattle to Miami to Tierra del Fuego. And in the 1960s, I think politically motivated, although I'm sure they thought they were correct, but I think the narrative was politically helpful for good reasons. A guy named Paul Martin said that the Clovis people were responsible for hunting all of those animals to extinction. Now, that's kind of a convenient political narrative, and it has some truth to it, because at the time we were coming to understand that humans are rapacious. We did not give a damn about species protection until the late 60s and the 70s, when we passed the Endangered Species Act, which needed to be done. And that the narrative was that we're so bad and we are so naturally so bad to our environment that we even caused the extinction of all these wonderful animals. And let's talk about that. Would be the mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed tiger, the giant ground sloth, the size of a damn school bus, right? The American camel, exactly. The American lion, the short-faced cave bear, on and on and on and on. North America used to look like the African savanna on steroids. And then there were also creatures like the glyptodon, which was an armadillo the size of a golf cart. Now imagine, because the Clovis people were only here for 200 or 300 years. it's a strange credulity to suggest that a hunter-gatherer tribe, even of great hunting proficiency, could have come into North America during a bitterly, bitterly cold time and hunted every single one of those animals down. Think it's an insult to Africa. They've been hunting elephants for thousands of years too. We still have elephants. Now, we've put a big herding on elephants. We need to watch our act, right? But we hadn't hunted them all down. And imagine the glyptodon. Who the hell eats the last armadillo? While there's still one bison around, or a bird, or anything else to eat, who eats the last cave bear? Who's the last guy in the cave to get the last cave bear when you still had ducks, right? There's just no way we hunted all that stuff down. But it was a mystery that then became a poor explanation in service of a political agenda that is somewhat justified, but science was abused in that case. And that's all become, I think that crowd, they call it overkill hypothesis, is waning now. And we're trying to replace that with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which is somewhat like I described before, but let's separate it from the Carolina Bays, which is that 13,000 years ago, or more accurately, my estimation, about 12,887 years ago in June, there's reason to believe it was in June, that we experienced a couple of days of bombardments of comet fragments from a comet that had been fragmenting in the solar system at that time for probably 7,000 years. It probably came in 20,000 years ago, and it began to fragment, and it had a solar orbit, and we crossed that orbit twice a year in late June and late October and November. And it's like crossing a highway blindfolded. Most of the time, you're going to make it across the highway, but occasionally you're going to hit rush hour traffic. And 13,000 years ago, we hit a patch of it that had a lot of chunks. And most of those would have exploded in the atmosphere, much like nuclear bombs without the radiation. And then there would have been others that would have made it to the ground. And those could be anything from oceanic impacts to misdated craters we see today, or perhaps the majority of them hit in the far north, and it would have hit the ice sheet and you wouldn't see the large craters. So I'll pause here, but that's the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it's been debated now for 15 years.
So, and just to piggyback on what you had talked about with these giant megafauna, we do have these anomalies as the hordes of frozen or instant frozen mammoth with food still in its stomach and its mouth. So there's some other anomalies where you're like, okay, that didn't happen. The Clovis did not, they didn't have instant freezing capabilities back then. So there are some additional anomalies that kind of throw, water on the idea that these megafauna were hunted to extinction by the Clovis.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is going to be a complete sideball, and if you have no answers, I will not. So the Venus flytraps were originated in Wilmington, North Carolina. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, now you're taking me way out on the hairy edge.
Yeah,
now,
so that's what I like to do. So since I've become aware of this, I did a lot of vacationing in Oak Island, North Carolina.
Oh, really?
The Brunswick Islands down there. I really like that. We have long talked about moving down there, but
awesome.
Anyway, I've been down to Oak Island several times. I don't know. The Venus flytrap origins coming from that general vicinity, and then having all this weirdness around this area made me think that maybe they're related. Can you call me crazy?
Well, I included that in that first speculative paper I wrote.
Okay,
right?
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but for instance, it's never made it onto my blog and things like that because I try to keep it in the road these days and stick to the published science. So that is rank speculation. But let's just think about it, that you've got this unusual feature found nowhere else in the world, the Carolina Bays. They're most highly concentrated within 75 miles of Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a perfect overlay for the Venus flytrap, the iconic meat-eating plant of the Southeast. But let me take you a little bit further on that.
Please do.
Yeah, that there is no higher concentration of meat-eating plants anywhere in the world than within 75 miles of Wilmington, North Carolina. There are, I think, 5 or 6 species, You can go to the darkest corners of Borneo, the deepest part of the Amazon, the wildest parts of the Congo, and you will not find meat-eating plants in the abundance that you find at the highest concentration of Carolina bays. Isn't that weird?
It is super weird, but again, just pile it on to the super fascinating things about this area. That you had mentioned this 1200 year period. What a time to be alive. There's got to be a movie plot out there where somebody can write a movie where we're all finding the origins of the Venus flytrap along the way. So it would be a crazy time. If I had to pick one time to be alive, that would be it for sure. So one more thing just to kind of pick. So we're looking for, okay, this hypothesis is out there, but there has to be proof, right? There needs evidence. You need to be able to be like, hey, there's a bunch of sites, if you will, to kind of confirm this hypothesis. So where do we find this? What do we find? And how prevalent are they?
No, it's a great question. So if you're going to publish papers, and remember we had that first big paper in 2007, we actually went to the American Geophysical Union World Congress, Hemispheric Congress in Acapulco, Mexico, to present the paper, and had a number of presentations and whatnot. And the essence of our evidence, and this is the original hack of this team, because we've had to work with very, very little funding. That may be changing soon, actually.
Nice.
But the best way to get the biggest buck for any kind of forensic research at that time was to go to well-dated archaeological sites that had been long understood to show this time period, because they would have Clovis points and mammoths, and they would test that time period and that soil layer right there. And it would be 13,000 years old. So there are a number of sites around the United States and elsewhere where mainstream science absolutely agrees that that period is 13,000 years ago. So what Dr. West and Dr. Kennett and Dr. Bunch and others of the leading lights, the qualified and credentialed people on our team, they said, what we're going to do is go to those well-accepted sites, and we're going to test the soil all the way down the face. And remember, soil gets older and older as you go lower. And if you get at certain places, you can find where it's been a grading for 13,000 years, where it's just been adding to itself. So you have modern soil all the way down to ancient soil. And if you test that soil, you're testing what happened at that time. As you go across that face, you find an extraordinary phenomenon. That's called the black mat. And maybe you could Google that up.
I have a picture. Give me one second.
You got a black mat picture? You're the man, Shawn. I love it, man. The black mat.
This is my favorite. This is one of my, other than Jeffrey Epstein, this is my favorite topic. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's great, man. You're my kind of guy, dude. Yeah. So the black mat, as you bring that up, is the damnedest geological phenomenon that you could imagine. And it is analogous to what science geeks might know as the KT boundary. The KT boundary, which is the boundary between dinosaurs and no dinosaurs. And in 1980, Luis Alvarez and his son Walter and Luis Alvarez published a series of papers that said 65 million years ago in the rock. Now, remember, this is soil. One day it'll turn into rock and perhaps look like what we're going to talk about that the Alvarez has found. But in rock that we know is 65 million years ago, there is a band of clay that it looks different. Now it's rock now, but it formerly would have been clay, etc. So there was a distinct band that you did not see again in the rock sequence, either before or below. And the dinosaur bones were only found below it. No one has ever found a dinosaur bone above the KT boundary. So that, by the time we came along, and they had to fight that out like hell. Been great books written on it. And by 1994, they found their crater, because that was clearly a major crater producing event. And it changed the world's climate for sure, too. But look at the Younger Dryas boundary as an analogy to that. So our scientists went to, this is Murray Springs that you're showing that beautiful picture of. And that's one of the iconic sites that demonstrates the black mat. Now, notice below it how the soil, although it changes in color, it changes right at that black band, and then it's never the same color again. So that's almost like a timeline of history. And we, the last two geological periods, the current geological period is called the Holocene, and it's preceded by the Pleistocene. In mainstream science, again, that cutoff between the Holocene and the Pleistocene comes at the end of the Younger Dryas, right where that black mat is. So our team went in and tested the soil across there and looked for proxies for impacts, for cosmic objects, just as the Comet Dinosaur team did. And those proxies include geochemical evidence, do certain is certain of the geochemistry demonstrating things that are more abundant in cosmic objects than are on Earth, like platinum and iridium. And platinum has become our defining rare earth metal, where at that boundary, it's extraordinarily elevated and something that you wouldn't otherwise find in such abundance on Earth. And then next, as you have a picture up, it is chock-a-block full relatively of spherules. And those spherules are molten terrestrial material and soil, perhaps mixed with some of the impactor itself, because in the air burst that would have occurred, it would have vaporized the material as well. It would have mixed with a molten hell of this material in the atmosphere that was really, up there cooking in just fireballs all over the Earth at 4,000 degrees centigrade, 6,000 or 7,000 degrees. I mean, this is intensely hot. So it melts metals, and you can go and say that chromium would only melt at this temperature, and this other metal will melt at that temperature. And you'll find them molten because they're up in there in a molten hell state, and then they cool enough to freeze. And when that vapor freezes, it freezes into those little spherules. And those were very key evidence in the Comet Dinosaur interaction. So our team looked at something 5,000 times more recent and said, we find the same things you find at the Comet Dinosaur boundary. And we also only find the megafauna, the Pleistocene megafauna, those animals we described, that it is only found below the black mat and never above the black mat. And we'll get to the black mat in a second. And in addition, we never find a Clovis point above the black mat. And in fact, is kind of a, field knowledge that Western archaeologists and paleontologists used to know, that as they dug and began a dig, they know they were getting to paleo soils when they hit the black mat. And they never published on it because they never really looked at it closely. But when we looked at just below the black mat, you discover this kind of breath of hell. And you find impact glasses too, where carbon has been molten into glass, as it's been kicked up in this firestorm. And also carbon spherules, where carbon has become molten and vaporized and gasified, and it goes back into these little spherules. So you find all of these impact proxies just below the black mat. And then the black mat, and a lot of people don't understand this, is not from the destruction itself, it's from the aftermath. That there was
it's not ash, right?
That's right. It's not ash. What it is algae.
Okay.
Is that we had a wasteland for 200 or 300 years, and that matted gook that covered North America at that time has now shows itself as a black band, and then immediately below it you find those impact proxies.
So I'm going to pull up this image. We showed the images of the spherules, and they were, all those spherules were at different sites. I'm going to pull up this image here, and
I love it, man.
There are sites everywhere, right? So these are the ones in North America. I'm guessing we referenced, or you referenced some of these already today, but I do see there are some over here in Europe and the Middle East. So are these all similar proxies that are being found at these sites, even across the Atlantic?
Absolutely. Everywhere we've looked, we found them.
Okay.
And that should continue wherever you go. And in fact, it's continued a little, actually a good bit past this graph. If you rewrote that graph again, it would reach all the way down to southern Chile.
Okay.
Where we found a site called Palauco that shows the black mat. Well, it's not the black mat, but a change at that time. And it's actually a visible change in the soil. But up in Europe, in Northern Europe, they call them the Northern European cover sands. and they're cover, most of the Netherlands, is sand, almost like the North Carolina. And you find the Usolo boundary there, which had mystified geologists up there for 150 years, that if you went down a couple of meters anywhere, in Holland and in Belgium and the Netherlands, and even into Germany, you would find a very distinct black band with nothing like it afterwards and nothing like it before. So that suggests that this was global in effect, just as the cooling was, and that something horrific happened at that time that blew all those animals away, not instantly. Some of them persisted. In fact, mammoths lived till 4,000 years ago. There was a refugia of mammoths up in an Arctic island, northern side, off the coast of Arctic Siberia. There were still mammoths. So, and some things survived in different forms, like the bison went from a gigantic bison you call Bison antiquus to the modern bison, which is smaller. And then, but some went completely away. The mammoth, for instance, right, is totally extinct. And what happened is, during that wasteland period, it had affected their ecosystem and habitat so greatly that, yeah, they might have hung on for a couple of hundred years, but eventually they blinked out. They didn't have the scale any longer to continue to breed and be successful.
And one other thing I wanted to talk about, and I don't have a map, so I failed here miserably, on the water level, the sea level changes that occurred at similar time, right? So we have I do have an image of what I think they call meltwater pulse 1A, 1B. I don't have the actual coastline of North America, for example, or the global coastline that actually shows the what North America or the rest of the world would look like, or the land would have looked like before or during the before the younger Dryas. But you can see that there's obviously a significant amount of land lost after this event happened. But it seemed to happen in two different stages, which again, they have meltwater pulse 1A and 1B. Were those at the one at the beginning and one at the end of the younger Dryas, or were those different times?
That's exactly right. And I'm not an expert in the water level, but it's the understanding by mainstream science. Remember, this is not the kooky stuff. You're just trying to explain all of these inexplicable mysteries. That the sea level rose some 600 feet. The North Carolina coast, for instance, was 60 or 90 miles further out in the Atlantic at the time. And there's a dramatic pulse right there. Now, then what happened, though, remember, you had all that cold. So what happened is it slammed into the ice sheet, was completely destabilized and shattered. And it sloughed off with all of the lake water that existed on a lake multiple times the size of the Great Lakes, called Lake Agassiz. So Lake Agassiz goes into the North Atlantic, and that fresh water cuts off the Gulf Stream, because the Gulf Stream depends on a certain kind of salinity. And all of a sudden you didn't have that thermohaline circulation, they call it, that causes the Gulf Stream. So it shuts that off. Well, that ice too probably would have sloughed off, and in the immediate aftermath largely melted. But then the climate changed so that it stabilized. You got a huge input of water, and then things froze up again, and the glaciers started re-advancing. And that's well understood mainstream science. So actually at the time, we were a little bit warmer than we are today, even though your graph didn't show that, but I know that's true. Your previous graph, or it didn't demonstrate it correctly. I'd have to look at it again. But right before the younger Dryas, it was as warm or warmer it is today, but you had 2 miles of ice, right? Still left over, like a slow melting ice cube on the north. And then when the cold came back, it got back to full glacial conditions, and the ice started growing again. So that would have taken away water, or at least stabilized the release of water. But then remember what happens at the end of the younger Dryas? You get a dramatic warming, and that would have halted and then reversed the accumulation of ice, and that water would have gone in. So that's why you get 2 jumps in sea level. You've got,
yeah.
So that's meltwater 1 and pulses 1A and 1B.
And so,
hey, Shawn, real quick,
yeah.
I apologize. I'm having all kinds of technical issues over here. If I end up getting kicked out, I am very sorry. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just not really sure what happened to my phone right now.
You got it. We'll probably,
as long as it's not for boredom, Ben.
Not at all. I'm enthralled. I'm just, all of a sudden I got kicked out because my phone got too hot. And I was like, I didn't know that was a thing. All right, I guess.
Isn't that weird? Yeah.
Yeah,
man.
So I'll put up that the temperature graph again here. So if that helps, that kind of illustrate what we were just talking about, how where the meltwater would have happened at the beginning of the shaded area, and then a second would have occurred at the end of the shaded area. Is that correct?
That's right. One kind of through destabilization, that you actually, the ice would have broken apart and the tremendous lake in Canada would have released. And then you have a cold period afterwards where sea level stabilizes, and then it warms dramatically. And what a wonderful day that must have been for planet Earth. I mean, it's just perfect for a movie, right?
Yes, it is.
It's got three parts. It's got the lead up, the disaster, the 1,200 years of turmoil, and then you get this rebirth of the Earth. And that's so clearly represented in that graph. And that's when things started coming back, but we were a different world after that, Shawn.
Yeah. Like I said, I have definitely, I'm not a script writer by any means, but I have thought a movie set in that time frame would be awesome. So
wouldn't it be cool as hell?
Yeah. I mean, as long as folks like yourself were behind the actual technical advisement of that movie, then yes, I guess I wouldn't want it to be
well, there's always
talking about
things,
terrestrial Carolina bays in that movie, but yeah,
it's going to come. Things like that are going to come. There's a multi-part series coming out that'll be of interest to anybody that's fascinated by these subjects, that should be on a major streaming platform within this year. And that's probably all I'll say about that. We're going to get some good screen time out of that, and that'll be an 8-part series that will include a lot of the younger Dryas.
Awesome.
And even some of the more speculative stuff, like Graham Hancock's work. There's a whole another universe of these kind of studies that preceded our forensic evidence of this catastrophe since the time of Plato. Plato said, 350 BC, I believe, that 9,000 years before my own time, there was a tremendous catastrophe, and the waters, the ocean swallowed up a civilization. And, that's called Atlantis. And that's immediately when people change the radio station, at least some of them, and say, okay, we have drifted into Atlantis studies. And we're sensitive to that, because it just sounds like something your kooky aunt reads, right?
Well, similar in nature, maybe you'll find this. I classify myself as unreligious, but when this conversation ever comes up, I always I'm unreligious, but I believe there was a global flood, and that usually allows me to.
There you go, man.
Bring it right to the I'm not trying to. I feel like people like yourself and others have pointed out enough information where you could buy a biblical type flood actually happen in human history, and
that's right.
And I've said I obviously, unless we can go back and check that, actually physically put ourselves back in time, I think all religions may have been birthed out of an event like this at some point in human history.
Very fair speculation, man. And, that isn't just Christians that say that there was a global flood. There are over 350 flood myths, well-defined flood myths, well-documented around the world. Virtually every culture on Earth says that long before our time, there was a tremendous catastrophe. And many of them say there were people there before that happened, and that they taught us later what we needed to know to thrive as we do today. And that's where Graham Hancock comes in. And those are the books that he has written. He has taken our science, and he wrote his first book on that subject, Fingerprints of the Gods, in 1995. And I was already kind of well into this stuff. And I read it and I was like, God, he almost gets it, but it was a comet impact. And he had talked about kind of some other causes, but he did define the younger Dryas and said that might have been the cause. And Graham and I have since become very good friends. But what it did to people like Graham, who were really way out on the speculatory plank there, they were saying there were precursor civilizations in a catastrophe. Neither of them were anywhere near being proven. What we brought to the table was the catastrophe. And I generally stick to that. And the Comet Research Group, which is our collections of scientists around the world that publish regularly on this, absolutely sticks to it. There aren't any big Atlantis folks in there. They are all serious material forensic scientists, laboratory people, right? They had no time for Atlantis. But that doesn't mean that people who had speculated about all the rest of human history weren't thrilled to see our discovery, because then they had the catastrophe.
Right.
And then I get to play in that sandbox because I got nothing to lose, right? I got no pending grants. I don't have to see anybody in the faculty lounge. I got nothing to lose. So I get to kind of play in both sandboxes. And that's why Graham's a good friend. And I don't think everything he says has been proven, but I think it's much more worthy of being investigated and taken seriously, because the catastrophe, in my opinion, has been proven.
Yeah. Okay. So let me, I don't know if pushback is the right word on there, but let me just throw out an alternative hypothesis, and you can shoot it down wherever it has. So maybe this is similar along the lines what Robert Schoch talks about. He talks about I think he calls it a solar outburst.
That's right.
And if you were going to pair a catastrophe, but it has to be cyclical, the sun does go through cycles that we can measure now. Any thought of whether or not I don't know, like a micronova event that would have been in relation to these solar cycles could have produced similar proxies on the ground through the heat, through some gigantic lightning or some kind of magnetic or electrical I don't know, something that came from the sun? Any thoughts to my
that's
idea?
It's funny when you get any kind of grouping of people, they immediately split off themselves. And so if you say catastrophists, and the people that believe, study, write, and speculate that there was a tremendous catastrophe 13,000 years ago, they split off into groups themselves. And that sometimes can be just as nasty as the people who believe that nothing happened and our whole way of thinking is incorrect. And that's kind of what's happened here. That I respect Robert Schoch to a degree. I've read his books. I've met Robert briefly, and he's obviously known Graham Hancock for a long time. But Graham would say the same thing I would, and the same thing that some of the scientists in our team who've looked at Schoch's work would say. He just hadn't proven it. Okay. Right? We've got more than 45 papers showing evidence that there was a tremendous high heat event, and also that we've been repeatedly interacting with the Taurid meteor stream. And kind of there have been obviously a number of, I'll tell you this, Shawn, first of all, I'm more worried about solar outbursts, CMEs, coronal mass ejections, as a personal threat to me, my family, and our way of living than I am comets. Right?
Okay.
I think it's absolutely terrifying. You know, one happened in 2012 that was pointed the right way or the wrong way, depending on how you look at it, that had it been pointed towards Earth and not, ejected from the other side of the sun, it would have been lights out. The Carrington event in 1858, it would be lights out today. We can't handle lights out. We can't have every chip fried. We would be eating each other within a month. And I believe that could happen within our lifetimes. Probably not odds on, but you go take another 4 or 5 lifetimes out, which is within our caring about our kids and our grandkids, and that could happen. Yeah. Where the event that we're describing, I think, is relatively rare, right? In relation to that. Okay. So to say that I don't, I'm very concerned and think it's a worthy field of study. I do not think the forensic evidence that we find and have published again and again and again suggests a sun cause, but rather some kind of cosmic impact.
And I don't know if you've had any interaction with Ben Davidson. He runs a site over suspicious observers. I find that his work pretty fascinating. He kind of tries to provide, I think, what you're looking for, studies or papers or whatnot, or articles, as he calls them, that are more sympathetic to the solar outburst thing. So I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but I don't know. I find the idea that the sun is, I say, underestimated, as you just pointed out, by our society is again, terrifying, but also super fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And the thing there is that if you'd had that event, it wouldn't have affected the Clovis people terribly, right? But they would affect us. Right. I mean, we're so dependent on the thin veneer of technology. We're so extraordinarily fragile, and have built our electronics based on an assumption that you're not going to encounter that kind of high energy electrical energetic event, and that is a false assumption. So yeah, it's out there, and you can't comment on the Younger Dryas event on any kind of YouTube or forum accompanied media without having the CME people weighed in. But they need to publish some papers.
Got it.
Right.
So I guess I'll wrap up with this, and you can fill in anything that we may have missed here before we do this, but about anything, about the Carolina Bays, about Younger Dryas, about anything. But I want to talk about what I feel like we just had a conversation. If that was taught in a geology class, a history class, a something class, when I was a kid in elementary school, high school, whatnot, as soon as I was able to kind of understand some of these concepts, I think that subject would have been fascinating. So I'm wondering why it's not taught now. Is it just because the scientists haven't died off yet?
Excellent question, Shawn. And that gets into the kind of the sociology of it. And it follows a pattern. I grew up, and I think you referenced it earlier, believing that science, particularly, in our age, I understood in the past had been corrupted, had a self-perfecting system to it. And that good ideas rose to the top and they would overturn old ideas. And that was a regular process, and that you could count on that proving well-supported things correct and unsupported theories incorrect. But there are some ideas that overturn so much current thinking that rewriting the textbooks just doesn't quite get to it. You don't just rewrite one textbook. You've got to rewrite the textbook for paleontology. You got to rewrite the textbook for impacts, because this suggests they're much more frequent than is admitted or supported by mainstream science today. It rewrites the textbooks for anthropology. It rewrites the textbooks for paleontology. They're about, and I need to go ahead and just sit down. Somebody did it once on the internet, and I'll go find it. Every discipline and ology that becomes that its understanding of the past is shattered. And that, they say science, as you referenced earlier, it advances one funeral at a time. But you've got to have multiple funerals at a time for this one to get the traction it needs. But it's happening, Shawn. The good news is, in the faculty lounges and in the hallways and whatnot, there are elements of the mainstream that, while they're not willing to seek a grant and they're not willing to redirect their own time at this point, except very few of them, that they've seen the papers. And if you go to the Cosmic Tusk and click in the upper right little hamburger menu, we've collected every single scientific paper on there, and a wonderful fellow, Martin Sweatman, in Scotland, has even gone and on all the significant papers done a YouTube video that accompanies them and walks you exactly through what happens. And one of the first things you'll notice is the supportive papers, which we do some editorializing and try to break it down into supportive, critical, in between, et cetera, and so forth. And we color code those. If you go read the critical papers, they're threadbare, right? They're more like op-eds. They're opinion-based, and they're sneering, and they're condescension. And then when they do provide forensic evidence, it's based on very little sampling, and oftentimes that's flawed. When you go look at our papers, they're tour de forces that run into the hundreds of pages with thousands of hours of lab work. But the mainstream will look at those papers that were critical of us and say, well, that was disproven in 2011. I haven't even bothered to look into it since then, because one archaeologist went out and tried to do some testing on the spherules of a type he had never done before in his life. And he didn't even use the proper equipment or the proper approach to doing this. First time he'd ever tried in his life, came back, said that there are no spherules, and that becomes their defense in sticking to previous understandings of Earth's history, one paper. There are others out there that are critical, But again, ours are far more definitive and do not get the treatment they deserve because it threatens many, many existing academics' publishing records. And that some of them are completely wrong about their central thesis of their career. For instance, the Clovis people killed all the species. You know, you're just not going to come on board with us and go reverse after 50, 60 years of teaching that. And some of them are that old, and they lead the thinking, and that's only going to happen a funeral at a time. And but we'll get there, Shawn. And I had an interesting call today with somebody that's interested in providing a lot of more funding in one fell swoop than we've had in 15 years. Well, so those kinds of things help. So yeah.
Well, that's encouraging, and like I said, you mentioned the a mini series of some sort coming up. That would be very fun for me or people like me. So, what do you want to leave everybody with here? So, I mentioned cosmictusk.com. Please, everybody, go check out the work being done there. It's anything else that you want to promote, publish, kind of give people a heads up on?
Well, I appreciate that, Shawn. And I went out and gave a presentation in Sedona, Arizona at a conference a couple of weeks ago on this. And afterwards, I swore to myself, because I'd forgotten to say, it came up in the question and answer period that we had with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson later about funding for the Comet Research Group. And I'm like, you know what? I'm never going to go on another podcast. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to say that if people are interested in assisting our research, they can go to cometresearchgroup.org and go to the donate page. And for the last 10 years, that's been one of our principal sources of funding, or maybe it's the last 6 or 7 years since we did a fundraising campaign. And it's been really successful. I mean, it brings in enough money to pay. There is probably no small dollar donation that you can make that could have more effect on science than donating to the Comet Research Group, because it goes directly into paying for those lab fees for microscopes, for testing the abundance of things like platinum. So a testing platinum in the soil series costs $40 a test. It's actually relatively inexpensive compared to some other stuff that you, like iridium's very expensive to test for, but platinum's $40. You give $40, you're paying for a real test that it's going to make a real difference. And there's no overhead in this group. Zero. Nobody's employed by it or whatnot. So if anybody is interested in assisting, you go to cometresearchgroup.org and go to the donate page and toss a few bucks in, either one time on a recurring basis. That would be tremendously appreciated.
And I will be sure to leave that link to the donate page there right in the show description. So, George, I want to thank you for your time. Did we miss anything? Anything that you wanted to make sure that we touched on?
And I'm on Twitter at Cosmic Tusk. Yeah, and I've got my real name up there, unlike a lot of people, but my handle is at Cosmic Tusk, and we're very active on Twitter these days. And if you're interested in this stuff, just searching younger Dryas in the Twitter search bar. Good thing about the term younger Dryas is it doesn't appear anywhere else in the English language. So if you search that term, you're at the rabbit hole, kind of like Carolina Bays. So yeah, at Cosmic Tusk, and love to answer any questions on Twitter. And I look forward to staying in touch, Shawn. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I have made soft overtures to the Randall Carlson team about trying to do something up here in upstate New York, because I know we have all these geological features that he talks about on a regular, Niagara Falls and the Finger Lakes.
Oh, the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, I mean, that's right in our backyard, right? We are.
There's no question the Finger Lakes perform catastrophically.
Yeah. So maybe we'll bring you on, or in the future we can try to do a New York specific catastrophic.
Love to. Well, I'll pass your name on to Randall. Okay.
I appreciate that.
Love for him to join your show too. Thanks a lot.
That'd be awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Okay, over and out.